Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining today's Coffee and Capital, brought to you by the Science Center. I see a lot of familiar faces here, so I'm sure you're aware that Science Center is a nonprofit that helps early stage healthcare and tech startups advance their innovations and scale their businesses through a robust suite of commercialization programs and through opportunities to convene with thought leaders and experts, much like today's session. So today we are joined by Ben Schrag. Ben is the SBIR and STTR Program Director and Policy Liaison at the National Science Foundation. These programs, SBIR and STTR, provide startups and small businesses with non-dilutive funding to conduct R&D work to spur the creation of innovative products and services and drive the business's success. So before we get started and we hear a little bit from Ben, we'll do what we usually do, and that's introduce ourselves to the group. So we'll just go around the room, as it were. I'll just call on you, and when I do, if you could just share your name, your company, what stage of funding you might be in, or what else brings you on the call today, though I have a good idea of what that would be. So let's see who's first on my screen. Heath, why don't you go ahead? It's an intimate group here.
Okay, great. Thanks, Jake. Appreciate it. Hi, my name is Heath Nakian. I'm the Vice President of Government and Capital Engagement at the Science Center, responsible for federal engagement as well as private capital deployment.
All right, thank you. Next up, I see Arlene. Arlene, if you're there, going once. There we go, cool.
Hi.
Hi there.
I was just getting my reading glasses, sorry.
No, no worries, no worries.
Arlene Starr. I am with Mind Matter Corporation. It's a startup company in Raleigh, North Carolina.
All right, excellent.
In the waste industry.
Great, cool, thank you. Thanks for joining. All right, Anthony.
Jake, how you doing? This is Anthony Cafagna. I have been in healthcare for about 10 years. I also have a co-working space in the Science Center and doing some independent consulting now with early stage organizations, Series A, pre-seed, seed. So just want to learn more about just the funding side.
Cool, sounds good. Good to see you, Anthony. Neftiri, I got your message. I see you can't speak. No worries there. Lynette, why don't you wrap things up for us, if you would.
Hi, I'm Lynette Moore. I'm the director of Quorum and work very closely with Jake on all of these programs. So just excited to hear the conversations that will happen today.
Awesome. Thank you, Lynette. And once again, I'd like to introduce Ben Schrag. Ben, if you would, maybe just say a few words about yourself and the work you do at NSF.
Sure, absolutely. So thanks, Jake and Heath and everybody for the opportunity. Appreciate it. My name is Ben Schrag, and as you mentioned, I'm with the National Science Foundation, and I'm with the Small Business Innovation Research Program. This is a program across the federal government for small businesses. It's a non-dilutive R&D grant or contract funding program. So I'm one of the program directors who administers that program here at the NSF. There are about a dozen of us. And what we do is we really focus at NSF on really pre-seed stage deep technology startups, giving them the non-dilutive funding they need specifically to attack the technical risk that's typically very high at that stage of company. So we're looking for this deep technology focus, and we're looking for all the things that I think early stage private investors look for in the sense of a strong committed team and strong sense of market traction and commercial potential. So we do that through the form of grants. We write checks of about $250,000, and then later on, if things go well, $1 million or $1.5 million. And our budget is about $230 million this year. So we're writing those checks to about 400 new companies each year. So it's a fairly scaled operation. And the program that we run is very much technology agnostic. So we require technology, we require high level of innovation, but we don't have a specific topic or technology focus area. So we fund companies from robotics to medical devices to new materials and everything in between. that's the elevator pitch, and I'm happy to dive in more as is appropriate.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you, Ben. And with that, we can open the floor to questions. So if anyone does have a question, please feel free to just come on mic. Nefertari, if you do have a question, obviously you can make use of the chat. But I'll kick things off while people are thinking. Ben, are first-time entrepreneurs appropriate candidates for funding, or do candidates need to have some sort of previous venture behind them?
No, I mean, first-time entrepreneurs represent the lion's share of who we fund. And part of that is just I think the nature of the business. Many times these science-based, technology-based companies, they arise out of a discovery, and a lot of times the person or people making those discoveries are scientists or engineers who may or may not have decided to chart a path as entrepreneurs. And so what we find that a lion's share, the vast majority of our companies are first-time entrepreneurs. And actually most of the projects we fund represent the kind of first outside funding into a given company. So not only do you not have to have been an entrepreneur before, but your company can really be very, very nascent for us to support you. Actually, we're actually just pulling together some data. We had some news about a couple portfolio companies last week, and we realized that there have been, as far as I can tell, 8 unicorns, 8 companies worth $1 billion that got funding when they were very, very small from us. And I think, depending on how you measure, 6 of those companies were led from inception to billion-dollar status by first-time entrepreneurs. So that's a very common success story that we see.
Question from Nefertari in the chat. Where and if how does ICORE and SBIR STTR intersect?
It's a great question. Heath could probably actually answer this question as well, I suspect. I would say the two are basically kindred spirits, I guess is the best way to think about them. They're both really aimed at the same type of person coming at different angles. So the SBIR program, which is now congressionally mandated, was created by someone at NSF in the 70s. And the goal there was to try to get more technology from the lab into the market. And then, that happened. The SBIR program has been around for several decades. And then in 2009, 2010, one of the program directors at NSF, one of the SBIR program directors, who had been working with the kind of companies we fund for several years, was trying to figure out how to keep so many of our companies from failing, specifically because of lack of understanding of the market, basically. And his name was Errol Arkalich, and he was the one who had the concept for ICORE. And so ICORE was created as a way to address what we saw as one of the biggest failure modes of our SBIR-funded companies. And so we see them both as complementary. SBIR is really giving you resources to de-risk technology. ICORE is giving you basically a method and a process and experience to de-risk the market. But they very often go together.
Awesome. And Ben, does NSF fund companies that work abroad, or like is it purely US based, or would a company who works out of the US but then has operations in other countries, would they be viable?
So there's certain rules about both eligibility and kind of national status. These are handed down by Congress and interpreted by the Small Business Administration. So if you're interested in kind of any eligibility issue, the thing I recommend for folks to do is go to SBIR.gov, which is not our site, that's the site of the SBA, but they're the ones who set the policy. And that goes for both the eligibility and also the citizenship issues. So to answer the question, thanks for putting that in chat. To answer the question, in order to be eligible, small business has to at least have a place of business in the United States. And more importantly, a majority of the ownership and control of the business has to be in the hands of what we call US-based individuals. And that could be citizens, or it could be permanent residents of the United States. So it's less about, you can have a place of business overseas, but we need to really look at who holds the reins of the company and make sure that those are US persons. And if anybody has a there's a lot of different, kind of variations on the theme about eligibility. I'm happy to take those offline if people have specific cases. But the SBA's website is like about a 12-page eligibility guide that I think is the best source for really parsing that question. But certainly we fund a lot of US-based companies who have their customers in their markets either primarily or entirely overseas, and that's well and good. And obviously, there's a lot of customers and problems to be solved offshore. So.
All right. Well, I have quite a few questions. So if no one else does, I can keep tossing them out there for sure.
I have a question. So what does success look like for NSF, Ben? What are the things that, you mentioned obviously having unicorns crop up out of SBIR funded companies initially is successful, but what broadly is the SBIR program there to do, and what are you looking to leverage the breadth of the program to do as the NSF?
It's a great question. Thank you for that. I think we are spending taxpayer funding, right? So we're looking for a lot of the same things that private investors look for, not because we have quite the same take on what the impacts are, are kind of our value function, but because we understand that for these kind of startup companies, if they're not able to create a commercial, viable business model that they can replicate, they're not going to have any impact. Whatever impact you're looking for is not going to happen. So the way I think about this question in two ways. One, I think, is basically that there is a gap in the private ecosystem, specifically for technology-based businesses with high technical risk, with long times to market, with large capital expenditures. It's getting better, but in general, I think investors are less willing to take chances on companies that have to build plants and have to develop new, biological materials or whatever. So I think one of our goals is to try to bridge that valley of death for those companies, and not necessarily, we know they're not all going to succeed, but if we can get a company from basically an unfundable place where there's just too much risk and it's too early, to a place where the private sector ecosystem of funding can kick in, that's to some extent a win. But obviously more broadly, what we're looking for is outcomes for the taxpayers. And some of them are traditional economic outcomes. If a company creates revenues, creates jobs, that's a huge impact that everyone thinks is important. We're also willing to take our impacts in kind of non-financial terms. So like educational or environmental or societal benefits. We have a company right now that is using artificial intelligence to detect human trafficking. And so economically, they're doing pretty well. They're not a $1 billion company, but their last count, they've basically saved thousands of women and girls from human trafficking. So that's the kind of thing that taxpayers can understand. That's a non-economic benefit of our program. And one of the nice things about this job is that we can be extremely broad and extremely inclusive about the types of impacts that we're willing to count as success. So to some extent, we want the entrepreneurs to have a lot of freedom to define both their business model and the kinds of non-economic bottom lines that are going to make impact for the taxpayer.
How would you say NSF's goals and success metrics differ from other agencies? Because I think at least my shoot from the hip impression is that NSF has a much broader grant in terms of the things that they can look after and fund. You have a lot more flexibility in terms of the way that you go about implementing SBIR as an agency. And so is that perception? Is that reality? Is it both? Is it reality because it's perception, or how does NSF vary from other?
Yes, I'll be careful about speaking for other agencies, but I will say that the NSF just as an agency is a much broader agency even outside of our program. It is an agency that what we call investigator driven. And so the idea is that the agency creates a lot of space for really great scientists and engineers and entrepreneurs to propose their ideas to us. And the goal is to not constrain them, because they are in aggregate much smarter than, even though we have a lot of smart people at NSF, they're going to have a lot more ideas that we haven't thought of. So NSF as a whole has this great culture that we're able to tap into in that sense. But I think the other thing is that we don't have a we don't have either kind of a separate operational function, the way, say, that the Department of Defense or NASA, they have SBIR programs, but they also have a larger operational mission that they have to execute on. All we are is a funding agency. We don't have, our whole job, everyone at NSF is involved in basically allocating funding. That's what we do. So to some extent, that gives us the freedom to not have to kind of cater as narrowly to an operational mission. Not that that's a bad thing, right? We're in the luxury of not having to defend the country, for example, like the DoD does. So to that extent, I think you're right in that we were able to kind of cast a wider net because we're not constrained by such a mission. We're also not constrained by a topical focus, right? So some agencies have a specific sector focus, and obviously they rightfully stick within that focus. There's no, the National Science Foundation doesn't have a particular area that's embedded in our mission. So we are more broad. And the way that we've kind of, given that all that latitude that we have, the way that we've kind of tried to find a thesis, if you will, for our program is that, we hire program directors who are all former startup founders or investors, basically, or have done this. And so we're basically kind of thinking about this as, a funding source in a certain part of the startup ecosystem that needs more support. And so that's the focus. The focus is really strongly on commercialization. That's the way we try to make our unique perspective in this broad set of SBIR agencies.
Can I'm going to ask you a leading question, Ben.
Okay.
It's a shocker, I know, but I think it would be helpful to understand. So for those that have worked in SBIR or with SBIRs in the past, the typical pathway is you submit something, you find out if you're going to get funded 6 months from now or later, then you do your phase one. If you're successful, then research happens, and then you apply for your phase two, then you wait another 6-7 months before you find out about funding. And there's oftentimes those gaps, we'll call it gaps in funding, that happen. And I know that you guys have been working very creatively to figure out at least how to, in the entry point, to shorten that gap, or give people, give people the yes or no quickly. And I'm just curious if you want to talk about sort of what's evolved from an NSF perspective about how you're trying to sequentially get that money moved out, at least in a more rapid fashion than maybe traditional SBIR or historic SBIR has been. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that question, Heath. So, I think this is still a work in progress. I think we've made a lot of great progress and really strengthened the program in a lot of ways. And this is probably the thing that I think we need to work on the most. So we have made some progress here, but I think that we should absolutely be faster and more responsive. But the things that we've done so far, number one is that we have created a kind of a quick go, no go process at the beginning of this before the big proposal documentation starts. Every agency requires a pretty significant set of documents to actually apply for funding. And it's hard for us to kind of avoid that. And obviously we want to do diligence, so we want to have a pretty deep set of information from the applicants. But we also want applicants to be able to understand without having to go through 20 hours of writing if they might be a good fit, and to get some feedback. So we've created what we call the project pitch, which is now a new first step that happens before any proposal. And it basically gives companies or entrepreneurs a chance to give us kind of the first kind of 2 pages of what they're trying to do. Think about it like a slightly expanded elevator pitch. Just enough information for us to tell them that there might be a fit, and here's the person who you'd want to talk to, and here's some feedback, or they're probably not a fit, and here's the reason why. And that'd be something where the companies could get in touch with the program director, who would then actually decide on funding for them when they apply. And it's something they can do anytime, and they can get a response in a couple of weeks. And so that's a relatively fast way to get feedback. We've had a lot of positive response to that, to the introduction of that. The other thing we've done is that we've created additional submission windows. So we do have to bring in our proposals, these phase one proposals, in batches. We have to do that because there's an economy of scale. We have so many different technologies that we can't really do them one by one. It's just too much. We need to get deep experts on all of them. And so if we have 3,000 of them, we have to find 6,000 experts. That's too much for the the 12 of us to do. So we bring them in batches, but we've tried to make the batches more frequent so that entrepreneurs have more opportunities timing wise to submit their phase 1 proposals. So those are now quarterly, and therefore entrepreneurs don't have to wait 6 months or more, as is the case at other agencies. The last thing I'll say, Heath, and I'm happy to dig in more if I've missed a piece of your question, is that we've started to allow folks to apply while they're in the first phase of funding, the $250,000 first award, to apply for phase 2 during the conduct of that, to kind of shrink the gap that might exist between that first phase of funding and the second phase. Because it is true, our processes, once you send a set of documents to us, in order for us to get, we have to recruit technical experts, we have to get their feedback, and then we have to do diligence of our own. And that process does take 6 months in both phase 1 and phase 2. So that's something that we haven't been able to make much headway on, but we're trying to build around that long process to make things a little more responsive for entrepreneurs.
So that's probably the biggest change, is that you're allowing the phase 2 to happen during phase 1 time period, right?
Yeah, you could apply and theoretically be working for another up to 6 months on the phase 1. Now, obviously, there's a trade-off there, because the more you've done in phase 1, the stronger your case might be. But some companies kind of will prioritize speed to phase 2 over having everything, all the T's crossed.
Right. So I'm going to assume that you're just starting to see a trends, like, because the phase 1 work can be 6 months or a year, but people will apply their phase 1 for 1 year, and about 6 months in, they'll do front loaded with a lot of research, and then do the phase 2, but still have that window. Is that sort of how it's starting to run?
Yeah, some of them are, and some of them want to be completely done.
Some,
Yeah,
not
yeah.
all.
No, but you're right. That's right. I think there's a lot who are trying to kind of scope out from the beginning and trying to figure out, okay, how can I basically ensure that I have something coming in to support the research throughout until this whole phase 1, phase 2 process is done.
Gotcha. Thank you, Ben. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
All right, we do have a couple questions in the chat. Arlene was asking, could you elaborate on the characteristics for the applicant's secret sauce that you want to see?
Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, the secret sauce is probably the biggest thing that differentiates, the universe of startups who are out there from the ones who are specifically a good fit for us. And so, the way we think about the thesis for our program is starting from the understanding that Congress basically says, you're going to run this program, you're going to give non-dilutive funding, and that funding has to be for research and development. So the funding we're going to give you is only ever going to be for you to do technical things. Our funding cannot be used to do sales and marketing or a bunch of other things that your company will need to do. So obviously that means our funding is one piece of a funding strategy. It's usually not sufficient at any stage of a company to pay for everything you need to do. But the thing that leads you to understanding that we only pay for R&D is to basically understand that if your company doesn't have to do $250,000 or $1 million of R&D, you're probably not going to be able to benefit from our programs. And so the kinds of companies that need to do $1 million of R&D are going to have at their core some innovative undeveloped technology. Otherwise, it's not as expensive to develop a product like that. So the secret sauce really has to be based in a new technology innovation, some new scientific discovery, new engineering innovation that is both potentially going to create a dramatic competitive advantage if it works, something unfair that's just going to make your company just way better in the market. And that is going to also create barrier to entry for competitors. That somebody's not going to be able to just take what you've done and replicate it or reverse engineer it. And so that's one piece. That's one hallmark of the types of companies we fund. The other hallmark is that the stage of the company and the level of readiness of that technology is pretty early. To the extent that we really look at phase 1, that there still remain deal-breaking technical risks to overcome. So that if you can say when you approach our program, this technology is pretty much going to work, I'm pretty sure of it, I just need money and time to kind of hammer it out. That's actually not risky enough for us. We're looking for something where that secret sauce can be well defined, but is still quite something that may fall by the wayside because you can't get it to work technically the way you need to. So that's kind of the two-edged sword of the perfect secret sauce we're looking for. It's the competitive advantage driven by technology and the technical risk to reduce based on our funding.
Right. And then Nefertiri asked, is there any movement on the Veterans Research Supplement Program as part of the big ideas for future NSF investment?
That's a great question. So yeah, this is a, so just for those who are not familiar with it, the Veterans Research Supplement is an opportunity we give to our phase 2 awardees. So folks who've gotten the $1 million check, they can apply for additional funding from NSF to bring in veterans, military veterans, as folks who are participating in their project. They have to be students of some form. They have to be associated with an educational institution. And so that supplement exists and is open and is taken advantage of by many of our companies. I'm not sure if it's been rolled into the big ideas. This is, again, another kind of broader initiative at NSF. I'm not fully engaged in that. That's something that happens kind of in parallel with us. I will definitely look into that and figure it out. But I think the big ideas really are more about kind of areas of science and frontier discoveries that NSF has identified. My guess would be that this Veterans Research Supplement, which I think started in our division and then was expanded broader NSF, my hopes would be that it would be expanded across the foundation and exist as part of the big ideas, but also as part of other legacy programs at NSF. But I haven't actually checked into that, and I can definitely look into that. If you want to reach out offline for Thierry, I can try to figure out. It's a good question.
And this tags the concept of supplements, which some of the people on the call may not be fully aware of. Maybe you could speak a little bit to some of the other supplemental funding that can happen, especially like I believe you guys are still doing the 2B type supplement for private investment match, but not the 1B, correct?
Yeah. So this is really the supplements are basically they're all things that are available to phase 2 awardees. So if you get through phase 1, you get through phase 2, or you apply for phase 2, you get the $1 million check. There's then the opportunity, as you mentioned, Heath, to ask for additional funding to support specific activities that NSF is trying to incentivize. And so we have a cornucopia of supplements. I can't go through all of them, but again, the idea is to provide additional funding for you all to do things that we think are going to help get to the impacts that NSF is looking for. So some of those supplements, for example, are relatively small, and they're about involving undergraduates or veterans, as we mentioned, or teachers in the conduct of the award, basically to expose them to the startup environment, to give you help and support on your project. So obviously part of what NSF is trying to do is to try to give new experiences to folks who are in STEM, because as we know, there's a lot of folks who get STEM degrees. There's not a lot of jobs in what you would call traditional faculty academic jobs. And so one of the things we try to do is expose people to different career paths in STEM. But yeah, to just touch on the 2 supplements you mentioned, because they're the big ones, Heath. One of them is the phase 2B, and essentially what this does is it provides basically additional NSF matching funds. If a company we fund in phase 2 is able to raise investments, that's basically directly focused on the technology we've supported, or product sales, or any kind of validating revenue source from customers, whatever, JDAs in some cases, we'll match an additional up to $500,000 up to 50 cents on the dollar. So if you bring in $1 million, we'll give you an extra $500,000. And there's an evaluation there, but if there's strong commercial traction, that's a very high likelihood of success. And actually, that program, which NSF has been piloting for about 20 years, was actually written into the latest congressional legislation for other agencies as well. So I think it will be rolled out in other agencies in some form. And that we find, just as a side note for those companies, we find that even though these companies are still early, even at phase 2, they're still many, many years out from their exit. In most cases, a company that can't raise $1 million of real validating money from somebody at that stage, kind of 3 to 4 years into the project, if you can't raise $1 million that really supports the business model and the technology, the chances of you actually having a big success is very low. So if you look at the economic impact of our portfolio or the broader impact, a huge amount of it is from folks who are able to raise that $1 million and get the phase 2B supplement, something like over 90%. So the reason for that is to basically to get companies to start thinking about the next stage of funding after the government, because other agencies may fund companies multiple times, but we typically don't at NSF. We try to really give you one award, one phase one, one phase two, maybe some supplements, and then you are graduating on to the next thing. And that allows us to basically touch as many companies as possible.
I think that's one thing, just, I'm sorry, Ben, but
no, go ahead.
I think this speaks back to the earlier point, just to make sure everybody's very clear on it.
Mhm.
You know, you made the point that you are not mission constrained or locked, right? Like you're funding investigators, but counter to say like a DoD, what you're alluding to is there, you know, folks that say there's a phase 3 SBIR where the agency's actually acquiring whatever that technology is. That's for mission-based stuff versus what y'all are trying to do. Is that accurate?
Yeah, we don't, you know, the NSF just doesn't have we don't acquire a lot of technology, right? So our entire budget comes from Congress, and about 93% of it goes back out to scientists and engineers. So there's not a lot of money being spent internally other than people who work here who make those decisions. So even if we wanted to have what's called a phase 3 and to kind of acquire products and services that our portfolio companies build, there's just not a lot of operations to support such acquisitions. I do know of 2 companies we kind of accidentally eventually bought their technology, even though without knowing it, because they got big and successful enough that other people at NSF, one of them is a company that just got bought by Cisco for $1 billion, and the other one is a company called CB Insights. I think it's public that we use their technology, and they're a company that we actually happened to fund when they got started in 2008, and then a long time later we kind of found them again and say, hey, we can track our companies using this technology that we supported that you're now offering, and so we're actually now a customer. We use their technology as well, but that's not we don't do that with intent up front. The goal is that the idea is that the more that we put our own needs and wants into this, the less that we allow our companies to focus on their passion and their vision. And we think the most powerful thing that companies can have is the freedom to pursue what gets them fired up in the morning. And so we try to really stay out of that and let them chart their course and try to align with what they're doing.
Ben, can an NSF fund be awarded to a company that's working on a product that's already been developed or before by another company, or are you only looking at novel technologies?
Yeah, so this is a question we get a lot. So one thing I would say is that this first step, this project pitch, the 2-pager, that's probably the primary way we answer this question for a given case. But the general answer is that the only way we would support an existing product is if there's something you're doing to the product that is both technically very risky, as I mentioned, that is not a straightforward engineering thing, but that is significantly different enough and unproven enough that it might not work. And that development is also something that creates a much more significant, bigger, different market opportunity, right? So that you're going from this small group of customers that's like a $25 million market to a $200 million market or $1 billion market. So if you can show that the work you need to do to build on the existing product has that level of existential technical risk and has a significant additional market opportunity above and beyond what the product can access now, then we might consider that. But if not, then probably not.
Well, this just reminded me as you're, talking about having to demonstrate, a difference between other products. Is there any preliminary data that companies need to submit, as part of their proposal?
No, it's not required. I mean, it can be helpful in some cases. I think there are certainly companies we fund where all we're given is a concept, and there's, you have to be able to describe the concept in enough detail, and you have to have done some sense of landscape analysis to see that, no one else has done this and to kind of understand why. But that doesn't mean you've gone and done anything in the lab yet. So you don't have to have that. I think maybe more important at phase 1 is, unless you're and you happen to be a deep expert in the customers, if you happen to be one of the customers, if you don't know the customers, very well, you probably want to actually do some homework on the customer discovery in some form on the market. Maybe not 100 ICORE interviews. That'd be great. If you have that, that's a great advantage. I don't think you need that many, but if you haven't talked to any customers yet, if you haven't really started to kind of test out, okay, I know this technology might not work, but let me assume it's going to work a certain way. Can I then figure out, okay, here's who I think the customer is, and kind of do the normal customer discovery process to some small extent to get a sense that there might be a problem to solve. So I think that's probably even a bigger factor when you're applying for phase one. As far as preliminary data, I think a lot of companies have little to none of that. Because again, I haven't talked about the stats, but the average company we fund, the median company we funded phase one is 2 years old and has 2 employees. So it really is pretty early for most companies.
And you mentioned earlier you award funding to about 400 companies each year. Was that across phase one and phase two, or is that just phase one?
That's new phase one awards, yeah. So
Okay.
That's the number of new phase one awards we make a year. We make about 120 phase twos. And so because those are multi-year awards, some of them, the total number of companies in our portfolio is around plus or minus 900. And you can actually go to our website and you can see a list of all the active awardees and search by keyword or by location. So for example, Pennsylvania, I know of a few companies, but there's probably a lot I don't know of as well in the area you guys are located.
Gotcha. So so how many proposals do you receive each year for phase one? So I'm just curious what the chances of receiving funding are for someone.
So, it's on the order of between 2,000 and 3,500 per year for phase one. There's exact data on this. There's data in these what they call annual reports. So the Small Business Administration puts together every year a report on all the SBIR agencies, and there's lots of granular data from all the agencies to those reports. So if you're interested in the exact numbers, you can go to sbir.gov and look for annual reports. I think you'll get up to 2019 at this point. Maybe 19 is not quite out. Anyway, the success rate to your question is at phase one is between 10 and 20% typically for NSF. It's a little lower here than at other agencies, mostly because of the breadth of competition that I discussed. As I mentioned, we have as broad a funnel in terms of technology areas as exists in the program. Good news is that at phase two, the success rate is around 50%. It's about 1 in 2. So it's not bad for $1 million lottery ticket. A 1 in 2 chance is not too bad.
Not at all.
And what was your path to NSF? Why are you dedicating a period of your career to identifying and helping these technologies get funded through NSF?
So I fell backward into a startup during grad school with my faculty advisor and another colleague, another grad student who I was working with. And so the day I defended my PhD, I had lunch, I defended my PhD, I had lunch, and then I went to work at the company. So I had kind of this unexpected transition. And my company got its first outside funding from this program in 2001, I believe. So I had been part of it. I had phase one and phase two awards. I was the principal investigator of those, so I kind of managed these awards. And I did the startup thing for 6 years, and I realized there was something that I was more passionate about, more interested in than research, which is I didn't expect. So basically, when it was time to kind of move on from the startup, I was very interested in this whole space of technology startups. I just thought it was so challenging and important. And I just kind of got lucky in that there was a position in Washington, D.C. And so the other part of the story here is that I had a two-body problem with my wife, which is what they call it when two eggheads can't get jobs in the same city because they're both very specialized. And so Washington, D.C. was where she wanted to be for her career. And so it turned out just that, we got also lucky that I was able to come and join the team here at NSF. And that was 2009. And the reason I've stayed is just because, again, I first of all, I learned so much from the companies that I work with. I learned a lot. I learned a few lessons, very, very hard lessons, very deeply at part of my startup, but I learned so many lessons working with portfolio companies. So I work with anywhere from 30 to 60 companies at a time here, and it's great to be able to help them. But even more importantly for me is I get to learn from them. And so I've worked with some of the best entrepreneurs you'll ever meet, and they've had huge world-changing technologies. So I think there's just a coolness about this kind of company, about the kinds of things you're able to do. But I think for me, the most important thing is that I really do feel like, this is a way I can serve my country in some sense, and that technology can solve not all problems, but it's a silver bullet for a lot of problems. And the ability to kind of help small piece of that ecosystem is really a powerful motivator for me. So that's why I've stuck around. Yeah, I mean, eventually, again, everybody will eventually move on. But for now, I'm still quite passionate, and I feel like I grow every day at this job. So it's been great for me.
Excellent. Nefertiri says, thank you for your service, Ben.
Thank you.
Arlene sent me a message. She asked, does the website include award statements on previous awards? Okay, great.
Yeah, so again, this is it's all the things that we do at NSF are very in the kind of scientific context. So what you'll see if you search awards on our website is you'll see basic information for the company, contact information, location, company name, and website, things like that. And then you'll see we use an abstract, right? So it's a scientific term, but the abstract for each project, and the abstract is going to be a paragraph about the technology and a paragraph about the impact. It's not going to give you the kind of elevator pitch in the same form you might get it, at a pitch competition, but you get a sense about what the company is working on from that. So you can search that on our website for any of our SBIR awardees going back to when the program started. Maybe not quite when it started, but at least back to 1982. So you can look up laser eye surgery or Qualcomm or any of those legacy companies we funded. If you're not sure where to find that, Nefertari, I can send you a couple of links. There's a couple of different ways to get to the information, but I think the best way to do it is to go to our website, seedfund.nsf.gov, and then go to the portfolio page, and you can search all awardees from the portfolio page. Thanks, Jake.
Sorry, it's muted. Yeah, so like NSF, NIH also funds biomedical and health projects through SBIR, STTR. Can you tell us if and how those programs might be different? And can someone applying for funding from NSF apply to NIH as well?
Yeah, so you're allowed to apply to as many different places in parallel if needed as you'd like. You can even apply for the same project to multiple agencies. And as I mentioned, our technical focus means that we do overlap with basically every other agency. A little bit less for some of the mission agencies where they're looking for very specific government procured products or services. But all of our companies, there's some of our companies have gotten funding from pretty much every other agency. So the only thing you have to be aware of is that we won't fund the same work twice. If you apply for a project that has overlapping work with something else, you can't accept both if both agencies want to give you the funding. So NSF and NIH, there's definitely probably the biggest overlap I think that we see. About a third of our portfolio is life sciences companies, and almost all of those probably could get funding from NIH, and many of them do. I would encourage folks to look at both. My sense, and I'm in the instrumentation and materials space. So I don't fund a lot of companies that overlap with NIH. So this is with a grain of salt. But my sense with the two agencies is that on balance, we tend to fund a little earlier. We tend to be willing to take on slightly more nascent companies who are maybe not as well-rounded yet in terms of the team, advisory board, stuff like that. And that we're willing to support maybe a little more of the platform type technology. The NIH is separated into a number of institutes, and each of them has a specific kind of disease focus or medical focus area. So what we have seen a lot of times is companies will get funding from NSF to support a broader platform, and then once the platform is starting to be applied to a given condition or indication, then NIH will provide funding to kind of go down that more kind of focused path toward a first use case. We'll take more, I think, risk early. I think they'll give you more money later. So they'll write checks of up to $3 million. We're not going to do that. So I think there's some complementarity, but I would encourage folks to look at both and understand that you're probably going to get to be too late for us a lot earlier than them. So if you have to do one at a time, I guess my instinct would be to kind of try to think about NSF first, but I would encourage folks to try both. If they feel like they're in the medical area.
So if a company is in phase 1, they've been awarded, and their R&D goals happen to change or their status changes, will that affect their funding, or will it affect possible phase 2 funding? Is there any repercussions or anything like that?
So the answer for this, I think, is probably pretty different at NSF and at other agencies. So this is an NSF specific answer I'm about to give you. For us, it's pivots are almost always can be accommodated if there's good evidence and process behind the decision. We have a very flexible award. We give a grant. For those who are not, I don't want to put anyone to sleep, but there's two major vehicles the government uses to give funding to external organizations. There's grants and contracts are very hard to change, which is why we use grants. And so the grant has the ability to be pivoted in terms of budget, in terms of scope. Your business model can change. That's usually not something that's written hardwired into the grant, but we've had companies do pretty massive pivots, and we're usually able to find a way, assuming we're still happy with your progress and your technology, to pivot the awards to what you're doing. There's actually there's a company that you can see this for. You can actually look on our website and look up the abstract, which is a snapshot in time. There's a company called Alteros. It was called Alteros Energies when we funded them, and you can look up their abstract, and you'll see from their NSF abstract that when we funded them, they were doing a technology to develop an airborne wind turbine, a wind turbine that floated up on a big blimp, basically, and captured winds at higher altitudes where there's a lot stronger and more consistent wind. During their award, the oil price crashed basically to zero, which has a huge impact on their economics, and they basically pivoted into a telecommunications company. And so if you look up Alteros today, you'll see that they actually provide broadband rural communications, because they're taking that same technology of this controllable aerostat, and instead of flying up a wind turbine, they're flying up a cell tower. And so during that award, we had to pretty dramatically rework what they were doing to reflect the change in their business model. And their company is, I believe, still doing pretty well. They're actually starting to launch their commercial product now. I think they have one in rural New Hampshire that's providing broadband for a lot of the state of New Hampshire. So big pivots are definitely possible, as long as you keep us in the loop and you give us good justification.
Ben, the technology we're working on is destruction of the contaminant PFAS in water, and we're working in conjunction with a university in China. Does that collaboration with China make us uneligible for NSF funding?
Probably not. So the work done in China is probably not something we could pay for directly. You'd have to find separate funding to support any funding that would be going over there. But the affiliation itself is not going to affect eligibility as long as it doesn't bear on the ownership and control of the company.
Great, thanks.
Sure.
All right, we have about 9 minutes left, so if anyone does have questions, be sure to get them in. But Ben, I know we've talked about it a bit, but I was hoping you could kind of guide us through what the proposal process looks like, from what criteria is being evaluated, and again, I know you've talked about a bit about that, and who's doing this evaluation.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yeah, so the project pitch is this first quick step. I talked about that. That's basically just an NSF program director directly evaluates that. And as I said, it's a couple weeks. Assuming that results in you being invited to submit a full proposal, that full proposal goes through what we call an external merit review process. External because we're going to bring in experts who are not part of NSF as kind of, special government employees for the day to review and give us advice on your proposal. The criteria that we use are kind of aligned with the kinds of experts that we bring in. And so that there's really two broad sets of things that we look for. One is the technical innovation and risk. I talked about that a fair amount. We're looking for a sound, discussion of technology and the ability to actually do the research that's proposed, in addition to the high technical innovation and differentiation that I talked about. So that's one set of criteria, and obviously in order to evaluate the technical criteria, we're going to bring in technologists, people, scientists and engineers, people who know technology, and so faculty members, industrial scientists, sometimes people who've actually taken things from lab to market on the bench. The other set of criteria are commercial, and those are the things that I suspect many of you live and breathe. Value proposition and team and all the things that investors at the early stage look for. And for those criteria, we're going to bring in investors and entrepreneurs, folks like that who actually do this in the private sector as part of their living. So guessing that, for example, Heath has been in that role for NSF. Many
times.
So those are the two big kind of criteria, and again, types of experts we're going to bring in. Those folks are going to be anonymous. They're going to give us advice. They're going to give written feedback that's going to go directly to the applicant. And then the program director is going to potentially do their own diligence if things look like they might be competitive for an award. And that would be directly engaging with the applicant. So what you'll see after you apply is once you put in a proposal, you'll see 3 months of complete radio silence as we do the external review, maybe 4 months. And then if you're in the potential kind of final cut, you'll start to get questions from the program director, and you'll engage back and forth by email or by phone call. But the whole process will take up to about 5 or 6 months, and you won't know really anything about feedback until the very end, until you get the decision. The process for phase 2 is pretty similar. There's one extra step at the end because it is a bigger award. There's a few more checks that we have to do. But that's basically it. It's a fairly long process with a fairly long period of complete information denial. So people should be prepared to not know what's going on for several months.
Cool. Well, I'll ask this, although I probably know the answer, given that you described it as a long process of radio silence. Is there any pre-submission feedback from program directors, maybe to help guide people along, or is it kind of just only the strong survive?
Yeah, so I mean, the project pitch, when you're actually invited to submit a proposal, there's always feedback that's given, and most program directors do give some pretty detailed, specific feedback to the company. Some program directors will give more or less personalized feedback because they want to be careful about, they have to eventually evaluate you. They don't want to necessarily lead you too much because there's a little bit of tension in the role of being an advisor versus an evaluator. But yeah, the place to get that type of feedback is either from the project pitch invitation, it'll be included, or if you wanted to reach out to the program director and see if they're willing to kind of give you anything else at that stage. But once you are preparing the full proposal, you're definitely welcome to ask questions. But as far as kind of us guiding you on what to write, we have to keep hands off of that process. But folks there's so many state and local and entrepreneurial organizations out there now who are actually thinking about this. I mean, the Science Center is a perfect example. I'm sure you have lots of folks in your ecosystem who've gotten these awards, who reviewed for us, who probably know SBIR. And so I would encourage folks, maybe at that stage when they've been invited to submit a full proposal, to start trying to figure out who in their ecosystem can kind of provide context. Like when I did this as a first-time 26-year-old entrepreneur, I got somebody to give me their phase 1 funded proposal. And then I gave mine to somebody once I had been awarded to give them an example. And I talked to folks, but there's a much better ecosystem now than I had. And so NSF will give you some feedback, but I think that the lion's share of the support that our companies get are going to be from their local ecosystem. which is why I like engaging with groups like this.
Excellent, excellent. Well, that's a great note to end on, I think. Although I will give anyone the opportunity to ask a final question or two, if there's any out there. All right. So Ben, we've shared a couple of links in the chat. Is there anywhere else you'd like to direct people? Anything you want to highlight before we hop off here?
Now, I think you put in our website, seedfund.nsf.gov. All the stuff you're going to need is buried in there. It's mostly in the Apply tab. But if you poke around that, I think everything I would point you to is linked in there. I will say two things. One is that we have, every 2 weeks, we have an open webinar for phase one. There's different focuses. Some are for brand new people. Some are for people who are preparing their proposal. We just do pure Q&A. And so we have about, last year we had about 17,000 attendees to those webinars. So they're quite well attended and people get a chance to ask questions. So if you're at that stage of learning about the program or writing a proposal, think about attending our webinars. We also have a bunch of canned webinars that are available on YouTube through our YouTube channel, and those will walk you through some of the various versions. There's a 2-minute version, there's a 5-minute version, there's a 30-minute version, depending on how much content you want. So for folks who are new to the program, I think those are great introductions. But yeah, I think you got the main link there.
All right, excellent. Speaking of YouTube, this will be available on YouTube in about a week or so and will be shared in perpetuity. So thank you, Ben, so much for this wealth of information. I thought it was a great discussion today. I really appreciate you taking the time out for us.
Thanks for the invitation. I appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Ben.
Jake,
Thanks.
Oh,
Talk to you later.
actually,
Bye.
I'm sorry, I couldn't get off mute quick enough. Ben,
oh, no worries. You can get it in. Yeah.
one follow-up question.
Mhm.
I mentioned working in conjunction on the technology with a Chinese university, and part of your response was that as long as it didn't have impact on control or ownership of the company. Our company is 80% owned by US citizens and 20% owned by a Chinese citizen. Does that make it not NSF funding not available?
No, that would make it eligible. The
Okay.
rule is that you have to have a 51% or more controlled by US individuals. So you
Okay.
sound like you're eligible. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Thanks for your time.
Thanks.
Great.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Excellent. All right, take care, guys.